this is this month's poem is I know it's a little bit of an unusual choice, partly because it hi Denise. Um uh Partly because it was on a list of poems about writing that I sent out about a year ago, and we talked about it briefly, um, and so it's a little bit of a revisit. Um, it's also it's kind of not a poem that you people usually think about this time of year, because it's in some ways it's more of a it's more obviously a spring poem than it is a winter poem. Um, but I just want to say that I mean why I chose it is it's a poem that has been especially haunting me uh, this year, um, uh, partly, I mean, it partly because it's a poem about writing and and or not writing, and uh, I think this has been a very challenging time for writers, for some writers. I won't mention any names like me, um, uh, and that um, it's somehow it's also a poem about kind of living through something, coming out in some more positive way. Um, uh, I will confess to probably no one's surprise that I am not a Christian and I have not been brought up as a Christian. And this is a very Christian poem. And yet it um, it really it really gets to me. I identify with it for various reasons that have that have a lot to do with I what I think poems do, what poems are for. Um, and we'll maybe we'll talk about some of these things, but let me read you the poem. Uh, if you don't know George Herbert, you should. This isn't his only great poem. Yeah, also partly I've been thinking about George Herbert because in the poem we talked about last month, Robert Pinsky's at Mount Auburn Cemetery, he quotes a line from George Herbert, not from this poem, but so he's been in my thoughts and in the poetry air lately, and that was part of it. So this is George Herbert's The Flower. How fresh, O Lord, how sweet and clean are thy returns, even as the flowers in spring, to which, besides their own demean, the late past frosts tributes of pleasure bring. Grief melts away like snow in May, as if there were no such cold thing. Who would have thought my shriveled heart could have recovered greenness? It was gone quite underground, as flowers depart to see their mother root when they have blown. Were they together, all the hard weather, dead to the world, keep house unknown. These are thy wonders, Lord of power, killing and quickening, bringing down to hell and up to heaven in an hour, making a chiming of a passing bell. We say amiss, this or that is. Thy word is all, if we could spell. Oh, that I once past changing were, fast in thy paradise, where no flower can wither. Many a spring I shoot up fair, offering at heaven, growing and groaning thither. Nor doth my flower want a spring shower, my sins and I joining together. But while I grow in a straight line, still upwards bent, as if heaven were mine own, thy anger comes, and I decline. What frost to that? What pole is not the zone where all things burn when thou dost turn at the least frown of thine, and the least frown of thine is shown. And now, in age, I bud again. After so many deaths, I live and write. I once more smell the dew and rain and relish versing. Oh, my only light, it cannot be that I am he on whom thy tempests fell all night. These are thy wonders, Lord of love, to make us see we are but flowers that glide, which, when we once can find and prove, thou hast a garden for us where to bide. Who would be more swelling through store, forfeit their paradise by their pride? Well, I know some of this is a challenge to contemporary writers because some of the language and some of the syntax is very much 17th century and not contemporary. So I think we can sort of sort that out, but in the discussion. But I don't know. Just before we get into the poem itself, what are your thoughts about this poem? Tom, you look like you're about to say something.
I'm trying not to, because once I start talking, it's hard to shut me up. But I just love this poem.
We'll worry about that.
Okay, I just love this poem. I actually think the language is remarkably simple much of the time, although it's talking about complex ideas. It sticks all the way through with the sort of metaphor of spring and growth and death, and God as someone you talk to very intimately. Although God is frightening, it's also a kind of conversation almost between friends. And so it has what seems to me a remarkable naturalness of tone. And one thing I was noticing, just as I was rereading it for this discussion, is he uses an incredible number of one-syllable words. And that's part of the simplicity of the language. I'm just going to read the last, and it's particularly true in the final lines of a stanza. Grief melts away like snow in May, as if there were no such cold thing. And, it's very simple. Almost every word is a noun or a verb. They tend to have stress. So for those who are into prosody, there's a spondaic effect of strong beats, which slows the meter down. It's not necessarily very iambic feeling. I once more smell the dew and rain and relish versing. Okay, versing is 2 syllables. It almost sounds like a grace note in the context of that very simple monosyllabic language. So just on the level of verse, I think it's remarkably interesting, but also on the level of a kind of intimate, complex, emotional communication with a core metaphor that is developed all the way through.
Yeah. There is, and this is true of Herbert. And I should have mentioned the title of your Bishop biography, which is also the title of a George Herbert poem, of Bishop's favorite George Herbert poem called Love Unknown.
Right. So I figured, why not steal it?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
it means so many different things, and the meaning kind of changes if you put it in the context of Bishop's life. So.
Yeah. Well, yeah, but I think your point is very well taken. That there is a kind of sort of intimacy in the language, in this discussion, in this argument or conversation with God, and that's true of Herbert in general. It's really, I think, what makes him unique among those so-called metaphysical writers of the 17th century, the metaphysical poets of the 17th century, that there is a kind of intimacy. There's no grandstanding. There's no sort of acting out or, upstaging. I mean, they're all wonderful poets, really great poets, but there's a kind of, Herbert is special in that way, in that intimacy. I think you see that from the very beginning of the poem, that he's in a state of just awe. How fresh, O Lord, how sweet and clean are thy returns, even as the flowers in spring. It's a very simple comparison. It's a very simple analogy, but it seems so kind of heartfelt and not sort of straining after some large or brilliant effect. And yet it just brings us into this kind of intimate conversation. I mean, it's going to be a poem about writing, or not being able to write, or being able to write again after not being able to write. And then he comes up with an analogy that's almost a cliche, but it's not a cliche, because he calls it the flower, and then he doesn't just drop it. He really kind of gets deeper and deeper into the whole idea of flowers and the way we are like flowers. In what way we're like flowers.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Lloyd.
Yes, Steve. Michael. Yeah.
Well, your intro about it being very Christian, and well, it's a nature poem, and I guess Christianity is somewhat based on a vegetation myth of resurrection in the springtime, and the poem, I think, is about that. I was going to say, why was Lloyd talking about this poem in December and not in May?
Right.
I think it's a dose of preventive psychology for many of us, because we're entering into a dark time where many of us perhaps need to remember that spring is around the corner. And I thought that was
possible.
very.
That spring is possible. Even.
Well, yes, spring is possible. That it will come as we face these dark days. So I wanted to just mention that it was very well placed in the year for us to read. But
good.
Boy, you see so much in the prosody, a lot of enjambment. I wanted to add to every brilliant thing that Tom said about the prosody. There's a lot of enjambment, which also bespeaks modesty, not the heroic ending of the rhymes and so forth.
Mm. Right. I hadn't thought about that.
Boy, stanza 4 just made me think of Gerard Manley Hopkins. And I was thinking stanza 4 just made me really think this must have been the stanza that young Gerard Manley Hopkins read when he decided he would become a poet, especially with the groaning and groaning thither. That's very, very in line with Hopkins, and then also later Theodore Roethke, the cuttings of the stems of flowers and weeds. And the terrible thing it is to grow. It's a painful thing. And I liked also in stanza 7, the line to make us see where we are but flowers that glide, and how he evokes a stream sort of. With this verb glide, we are on a stream of time. One other thing I wanted to point out, he talks about being old in his age. Herbert only lived to be 40 years old.
Yeah.
And often people came to their first maturities in life in their late teens, maybe comparably to what we become in our late 20s or early 30s. Life went very fast. And I think to get a perspective on time and how generously many of us are bestowed with it is to think about George Herbert, who would die at 40 years age, and even come to the time of speaking that he has seen many deaths. He has been through many things. He's celebrating a recurrent greenness that many of us only start to sort of think about when we're 60 something. So, so it's a remarkable poem. I love it for its simplicity and its modesty, and its imaginative qualities.
I'm so glad you mentioned Hopkins, because I looked up to make sure it was Hopkins, the line, "Mine, O thou Lord of life, send my roots rain."
Mm-hmm.
In the poem that begins, "Thou art indeed just, O Lord." But the imagery is so perfect, and the urgency of feeling. As I said, I you can always look it up. I just looked it up to make sure that's not the same poet. That's Hopkins.
Yeah, and I mean Hopkins is another theological poet that I really, whose theology is very different from my own, but whom I really identify with when I read his poems. I sympathize, I empathize with the experience. It reveals it's an illumination of a human experience, not just a theological experience. Jennifer?
Yeah, I wanted to say something about that that I once past changing were. Listening to you read it echoed for me. It made me think how many of Herbert's poems have, this is too fancy, but have an intermediate that is a wish, he bursts out in a wish. I wish it could always be great. I wish there could always be flowers.
No,
and it is an intimate ode to God. Why can't you make it always that way? But
right.
Then he often uses so the poem allows for that wish, but then he usually uses the rest of the poem to sort out, well, you know better than I do. So as long as I can remember that I'll come back to this, it doesn't necessarily have to. I mean, this is really just to second points that you made, Lloyd, and the others who have spoken, but that in building that, so the poem is a vehicle for letting him say, I wish it were like this. Couldn't you make it like this? And then, I understand why you don't. I understand that to want it to be like this all the time would be expressing pride or wanting to give myself power or being invested in stasis. And what you're giving me to love is participation in this kind of process. But, Herbert helps me this way by giving room for just this burst, this he uses O's for other things too, but often there'll be a wish, that I were an orange tree, he'll say, that, and I love that bursting into wish and the way the poem makes a house for that, and then come to terms with the idea that there's a larger pattern that's mysterious to us that makes sense of why that wish can't straight be granted, so I say.
Yeah. Well, I think that's wonderfully said, Jennifer. It's so true. It's one of his most human qualities, one of his most personal qualities, that he is willing to really expose his own deepest fears and wishes. And it's so touching that he is allowing himself to be so personal, so human in his poetry. He's also let me just take a little turn while we're talking about the first stanza. He's also one of the most inventive prosodists, that is, in terms of structuring a poem. There are almost, I don't know of almost any two poems by Herbert that are in exactly the same form. And this, I wonder if Keats knew Herbert. He probably did. I don't know if he ever wrote about him, though. But that in every one of these stanzas, just before the end of the stanza, the lines get very short and they're very simple. And again, grief melts away like snow in May. It's almost a kind of elementary rhyme, and then the last line of the stanza, which seems, it's almost inarticulate and almost, I think it's something that you would say to someone who knew you, whom you weren't trying to impress, as if there were no such cold thing. It's already kind of breaking my heart when I read that. Um, uh,
Why do you connect it to Keats? Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
oh, because I think in the Ode to a Nightingale, every stanza has a very short line in it that
Okay.
that seems very surprising.
Do they call that a bob?
I'm sorry.
Do they call that a bob? Do they call that a bob? A bob.
I don't.
The short line.
I'm a bob. I'm not familiar with that expression.
Sorry, it just came to mind. Never mind.
Tail and bob.
That's kind of fun. It's kind of fun. Bill, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think there's a form called tail and bob, isn't there? I don't know whether this pair of dimeters would quite count in that way, because it may do. I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that terminology. Thanks, Celia. Yeah.
Lloyd?
Yes.
I just wanted to say that the detail, the complexity of the verse form here cuts against, in a way, the inevitable, or at least is some sort of an answer to the inevitability of our blooming and dying. You know, that he's making this gorgeous structure in the face of death. And I think one of the most compelling emotional situations of the poem has to do with, it actually fits very well with us reading it at this time of year, because it says, and now in age I bud again after so many deaths, I live and write, you know, in the winter of my age, my life, I'm still budding. It reflects that second stanza, who would have thought my shriveled heart could have recovered greenness? And, you know, in a way, this could be such an angry poem, because he's really saying, I've been through all of this death. My heart has shriveled, but he's trying to understand this in God's terms, despite the fact that his verse form shows this incredible inventive complexity, even in that face of death.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. He died of TB. He was essentially, he kind of grew up to be, or was educated to be, a politician. He was in Parliament, and then all of the aristocrats from the king down lost their, mainly died, and his support from the top disappeared, and he became, he sort of went back to school. He became a clergyman in this little tiny town in, I think, near Salisbury, if I'm not mistaken. So he was someone really on the rise, on the political rise. And then he suddenly became this little, tiny hamlet preacher. And I think very few people knew that he was writing poetry during this time. And there's one story that he had a manuscript. This poem is from a book called The Temple, which is very complexly organized around, it's almost like a sort of architectural plan of what each what each element of a church expresses. It's kind of, anyway, I find that all sort of interesting and not interesting at the same time. But on his deathbed, he gave his. Sorry about that may be my phone ringing, but please ignore that. I thought I tried to prevent that from happening. Maybe. Oh yes, on his deathbed, he gave his manuscript to a friend of his and said, publish it, destroy it, you decide. And fortunately, I mean, we wouldn't have anything by him if the friend had said, okay, I think he wanted me to destroy this. And I mean, that's almost all. There were other things that he published, but he didn't publish poems. Mainly, he didn't publish any of these poems. Some poems in Latin, I think, were actually in the world, but none of these poems in English were. Who would have thought? I mean, again, it's just that it's so colloquial, it's so intimate, it's so interior, because who means him, doesn't it? Who would have imagined my shriveled heart could have recovered greenness. So we're back in that metaphor of the flower, of the seasons. It was gone quite underground, and now he's really he's pushing that metaphor further than we might have expected. Aren't we Christians blessed with this seasonal renewal? But now he's really getting more personal and kind of taking this sort of almost cliche and really kind of pushing it, seeing what else is inside that image. What does it mean? My shriveled heart was gone quite underground, as flowers depart to see their mother root. I mean,
Lloyd, I wanted to mention a thing. You were mentioning the altar, and there's another poem that many of us should be aware of, Easter Wings. And I just wanted to mention the shape poems, or we call them calligrams. Well, if you thought Apollinaire invented it, we have to go way back to Herbert.
Yeah. He actually had poems that he printed out in the shape of the image that he was writing about. So Easter wings really look like wings on the page. The poem actually sort of depicts that image. Mary, what were you had your hand up a second ago.
Oh, yeah, I was just I just love the second stanza so much. And where you had paused, to see their mother root. I just, for me, the second stanza, and you're right, it is where it suddenly becomes very personal, very intimate. And as someone who spends a lot of time underground myself, I really appreciate his, and he really dives deep, and he gives me a different angle on what that means to be underground. And I just also wanted to comment on the humble domesticity in that stanza, right?
Keep house. That's not a cathedral. That's really, that's home.
Yeah, and unknown, and anonymously is just the whole thing. And the mother root is fascinating to me. It's not the way we typically think of going underground or being dead or whatever. Anyway, I just love this poem. I'm so glad that you. So yeah, that second stanza really gets me going.
Yeah. Good. Yes. Jennifer, was that your comment? Yeah, about I mean, I think one of the great contemporary books that actually that this poem really foreshadows in some way is Louise Glick's book, The Wild Iris, which is about, guess what? It's about flowers and their metaphorical and emotional and psychological significance. It's a wonderful book. It's her Pulitzer Prize winning book. It was a real kind of breakthrough book for her. I encourage everyone to look at it. These are thy wonders. Oh, I know. I can't leave the second stanza without blown is one of those words that has changed meaning since the 17th century, and it's really the equivalent of grown, Grown. But I think we can sort of figure it out. It's not hard to figure out what it meant at the time, but it is one of those words that you in some way you kind of have to look up, because well, are we sure we know what it means? Because we just, it's a word we know, but we don't use it in the same way anymore. And I mean, this is just one of the problems about reading poems from earlier eras.
But botanists do use it the same way.
Is that true?
Botanically, yes. For instance, if you speak of a full-blown rose, you speak of one that's so completely open its petals are about to come falling down. So, so that's whatever other meanings it's acquired. That one has remained as a specialist word.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course. And full blown isn't even that obscure, but yeah, you're right. I mean, it's that original meaning has persisted, but it's a little hard for us in this particular context, because we don't usually use that word. Even a phrase like dead to the world. Again, I mean, the language is so it's so colloquial. Some of the language, at least some of these phrases, are so colloquial, so commonplace. They really are on the verge of cliche, dead to the world. And yet he really means it. He means it in a kind of literal way. And it also, for me, maybe the most important thing is that it's so personal that he's sort of not worried about, as so many poets are. I won't excuse myself either. Trying to really be personal and intimate. It's something that you would say to someone you were very close to. You know, that you wouldn't be striving for some kind of fancy effect, and that you could say, you know, he was dead to the world. Anyone would say that. And then he really means it. He really means it here. And it's very touching. These are thy wonders, Lord of power. Well, now we see some kind of power relationship in here. This is Lord of power is not something that you would say to a close friend. I suppose I wouldn't. Killing and quickening. Quickening again is another word that's kind of lost its original literal meaning, and quickening really here just means living, bringing back to life, bringing to life. We do, what do we say? There's the quick and the dead, and quick doesn't mean fast. It really means just alive. Bringing down to hell and up to heaven in an hour. Well, there is your these radical mood shifts, which we don't have to be religious to feel, and which I think probably most of us have been feeling every few minutes during the last, especially during the last couple of years.
But
Denise, yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say that to me brings to mind the William Blake passage about holding infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. It's a reference to God's time as opposed to human time.
Yeah.
So, another pious man, pious poet.
Right. Anyone can anyone parse can anyone parse making a chiming of a passing bell, or can you sort of figure out what it means, even though these are not they're not terms that we're familiar with as in our century?
Well, just to throw in a thought, a passing bell would be rung when somebody died,
right,
or passed. And
right.
A chime would be a beautiful sounding bell. So you'd be taking a bell signifying death and making it into beautiful chimes. So God can kill or quicken, make us feel good, make us feel bad in the course of an hour or a very brief time.
Yeah, really kind of,
it's also,
bipolar, manic depressive, how quickly our feelings can how radically our feelings can change in within a very short time.
Right. And if I could just jump on that for a second.
Sure.
One of the ways I read this poem is as a poem about clinical depression and recovery. And so aside from the discussion with God, it could be an exploration of maybe a cyclical process of going through depression, which is like winter, and then coming back. And, one reason someone might not be relishing versing is because they're depressed. And then they come back. And I don't even know why I came back and started to feel better.
But thank God.
Thank God, yes. Thank God, or thank whatever powers that be, that I feel okay again. And again, that's almost the flower and winter. All of those might be almost cliches, but he sort of weaves it in such a subtle, quiet way that you can see that or not see that. Poem works either way.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. We say amiss this or that is. That's it. I think that's one of the strangest kind of moments in the poem. I mean, there's it's almost an echo of to be or not to be. This or that is.
Doesn't it have?
Yeah, Denise.
Doesn't it have to do with the illusory nature of human knowledge? We say this is the way things are, but of course we're wrong because we can't possibly know.
We can't know.
Knowledge, but also the physical world.
I'm sorry?
Can we go back to the passing bell for a minute?
Oh, sure.
It was also a standard way of announcing who had died in a community. And if he had gone back to being a cleric, you get 3 short bells for a male and then 1 for each year of their life. Only 6 for a woman, of course, because they counted less.
Right.
But a passing bell is an announcement of how long you've lived as well as that you've died. It's still used sometimes. If you go to the fancy enough church, they'll do it.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Also,
9 Tailors by Dorothy L. Sayers explains in detail.
Oh, that's fantastic.
All that stuff.
Also, to jump back to the line on the heaven and hell in an hour, it's making an allusion to a religious concept, a Christian concept of the harrowing of hell, where Jesus in Easter goes down to hell to release, Homer and Greeks, people of antiquity who were noble enough to be released from hell. There's not a lot of. Catherine could speak more eloquently to this than I, but there's not a lot of biblical support for this, but it was a widely held belief, and it showed up in a lot of art, where they'll show, Jesus knocking down the door to hell in that hour.
It crops up in Piers Plowman, doesn't it? The harrowing of hell. In Piers Plowman, the William Langland poem.
Yes, I haven't thought about Piers Plowman in about 40 years.
Okay.
Another thing, Lloyd, that I just want to. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Bill.
Bill, go ahead. David?
I was just. Let me. I'm back out.
I've been going to say there's a little bit of process philosophy going on here. that the passing bell, which is at least ambiguously an object, becomes a chiming, that this or that things get reduced or switched over to words. Everything's being ephemeralized, but also sort of turned into processes rather than objects.
Yeah, I see that, and my guess is that Herbert does that a lot, though I hadn't actually ever focused on that myself.
A confirmation of Catherine's point about the persistence of the ritual of the passing bell is provided by, I think, the first line of Anthem for Doomed Youth by Wilfred Owen, what passing bells for these who die as cattle. And the start of Gray's Elegy, although it refers to a curfew bell, is often construed as referring to a passing bell. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day.
Yeah.
So the passing bell is quite ubiquitous in English poetry. Well, I think, yeah. Is in that line we say amiss this or that is the note of sort of self-accusation present there, associated with Herbert's reluctance to publish in his lifetime and his countenancing the possibility of his work being destroyed at his death? Is that the beginning in the poem of a certain guilt about the presumption of writing, because God's word is all, and the word of the poet is in presumptuously usurping a divine privilege in a way? Is that part of it?
I think that is very likely behind exactly what's behind this, for the very reason that you mentioned, that dichotomy, we say amiss this or that is, and then it's about words. And
that would also clinch.
Thy word is all.
Yes, and my word must be suppressed so that thy word is paramount and unchallenged. That would also clinch the connection that people have been at pains to make with Hopkins, since I suppose his willingness for his own poems to be suppressed is associated with his seeing them as sinful and vain.
I wonder.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, riffing a little bit further on that, I think of a Herbert poem like Prayer 1, which tries in phrase after phrase to say what prayer does. And it's like fireworks that at the end, the ash comes down and it's just, he says, church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, the land of spices, something understood.
Understood.
And it's a kind of a way of, well, it's not exactly having his cake and eating it too, but it's sort of saying, if I recognize at every step that I can't have these wishes, I can express the wishes that I can't have, and I can exhaust the effort to get to God in these phrases that come closer, even though they do nothing. And
engine against God as well.
Yes.
Engine against God. That would the poetry as somehow antagonistic to God, even as it in one sense reveres him.
Engine against the almighty Christ side piercing spear.
Yes.
It's just it's right. It's spectacular, and then it ends with, of course, there's no way of putting this into words.
Yeah.
And
so again, it's like that mix that I felt at the first with this one, where there's an O in the middle that says, I wish I could do it. I know I can't. I wish I could. The poem is a vehicle for like giving expression to that wish and trying to find the process of coming to terms with its impossibility, or the impossibility of fully granting it, and saying, well, if we can't be with God, we can keep always trying to be closer to God if we're humble about the possibility.
I think that poem called Prayer, and it's called Prayer in parentheses 1 because he has several poems called Prayer, but that the famous one, the first one, has got to be the best list poem in the entire English language, and it's a sonnet. It's just staggering achievement. But I think my favorite moment in this third stanza is "If we could spell," and then he becomes like a, I don't know, in my mind he becomes like a kind of school kid who is not a very good speller. and
yeah, I mean, I agree, Lloyd. I think there's some resistance there. It's kind of like, well, okay, I get it, thy word is all, but I can't spell. We can't really spell.
I'm not good at spelling.
So
yeah.
where does that leave me? I do sense some, he's polite about it, but I sense some frustration, just what do I do now if I'm never going to be able to spell this thing?
Yeah. And that it's his own what's the word? His own feeling of inadequacy, his own, which again is there's not a whole lot of poetry, a whole lot of great poetry about in which which is about I wish I were a better poet. I wish I could write better.
I'm sure there are a lot of poems about that, but maybe not ones we would ever know.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
I think, Shelley often wrote about the inadequacy of language to express an idea or an emotion, not necessarily in a self-deprecating way, but just to say, there's only so much that I can express through words. That's what I was reminded of when he talks about if only I could spell.
Wow. Yeah.
When he said, if we could spell, it reminded me of if we had some ham, we could have some ham and eggs. We had some eggs. That made me wonder if there's, I mean, that's so, if we could spell sounds so modern in that sense. Is there an earlier meaning to spell?
Yes, I think someone, Denise, was that you who?
Jennifer just in the chat.
Yeah.
Someone put something in the chat about.
Yeah, it sort of means like if we could parse that, if we could interpret that. But both, that's not to take away from the contemporary feeling would be there too.
Right. Well, that's, I mean, that is one of the sort of challenges of poetry of this period. But I kind of love that the way that the change in language actually adds to the kind of dimensions in the poem.
Lloyd, I think both senses would have been present.
Right. I agree. But only one of them has survived. Yeah. Oh, that I once past changing were. And I mean, that who hasn't felt that? Fast in thy paradise, where no flower can wither. So now remember, this is a poem called The Flower. I'm going back to my central image. Daniel, that's right. Don't be timid about just saying these things. I sometimes miss what's going on in the chat. So don't be shy about just saying what you're thinking out loud. Fast in my power.
Since you mentioned the title, and
yes.
Is there some significance to the fact that the flower is introduced merely as the vehicle of a metaphor, and yet it isn't entirely happy to stay in that subsidiary role, and it, as it were, usurps literal centrality, and the title's granting salience to it, as it were, confirms that process. So although the flower is an image describing, helping to describe the poet's predicament, it acquires an autonomy of its own as well.
Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting thinking about. I mean, I hadn't really sort of articulated this before, but so many of these of the poems in Herbert's book are inspired by literal parts of the church, and the flower is not. I mean, there might be flowers in the graveyard, or
no, there are flowers on the altar.
Flowers on the altar.
Yes.
Right. I'll have to think about that, but it's not part of the architecture.
No. Well.
And so it feels a little different to me than the poem that Robert Pinsky quoted, Church Monuments, is actually, a kind of architectural feature of the church, or a theological issue.
Yes, but the church, in addition to its architecture and its monuments, has got, I don't know what you'd call it, software. Okay. You have the fair linen that you spread on the altar, and the altar cloth over that, and then there are all these other cloth things that you use when you're setting up the chalice and the host, and there are vestments. And there are movable brass things like candlesticks and vases, and into the vases go the flowers, and a few green leaves.
Right.
But flowers are the one thing that aren't man-made, right? I mean, the flower could be one of the parts. It kind of fills in for this or that is. I mean, in a way, he's trying to spell the flower.
Right.
Possibly. I don't know. I guess I see them as sharing a world, but being of very different natures. Yeah. I don't know.
That's my impulse, is that this is something, this is a little different from most of the other sort of subjects of Herbert's poems. But I have to, Denise, I have to think about that. It certainly makes sense.
Lloyd, can I just
yes.
offer that I think with the flower, it's the antithesis of the stone and the mortar and the immovability of that architecture. that
right.
does not change.
That doesn't change. Yeah.
And I think it's a really nice way to sort of set us off. And somebody mentioned it's a vehicle for the metaphor, and it sort of usurps. And I get that sense around the architecture and the structure throughout ages of the buildings, and yet seasons happen and there's constant movement.
Right. We are approaching our hour, and there are a few things that I think the best, the most extraordinary things in this poem are about to happen. We've mentioned some of them, but can anyone want to deal with nor doth my flower want a spring shower, my sins and I joining together?
Well, it's tears, right?
Yes.
You're crying.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He certainly, he's really being metaphorical there, and then not explaining the metaphor and leaving it to us. But I think that's exactly right, that he is weeping. He is weeping, and his weeping in a way is reviving the flowers, and we have to kind of put that together. And I want what frost to that, what pole is not the zone. So zone is really like the equator. But for me, what I wait for when I read this poem is, and now in age I bud again, after so many deaths, which you've commented on already, I live and write. And that's the big surprise in this poem. There are all these hints, the word and spelling. Bill, you really sort of got that, nailed that. But then the poem is really literally about being a writer, about being a poet. After so many deaths, I live and write. I once more, and then this is, writing is identified, he identifies writing with smelling the dew and rain, all this kind of flourishing. And then I don't know, I think one of the phrases in the entire history of poetry that gets to me most is relish versing. And it's not just being able to, but loving what he's doing. I mean, tasting it, and really kind of living so fully and enjoying so fully his ability to write again.
Does anyone have a sense of the profile of versing in the 17th century? I mean, if we were to describe poetry now as mere versing, we'd be,
right,
in a sense, diminishing it or depreciating it, wouldn't we? But is there that self-deprecatory note there? Would an alternative, does verse stand in opposition to poetry in the 17th century as the lesser activity?
I can't speak with any authority on that. I think there is a way in which he's kind of playing with that. And that versing, that versing is there's a kind of modesty, there's a kind of diminishment. Oh, all I'm doing is putting words into verse.
I think there's also a heliotropic metaphor, like versing as turning toward the light, relish versing, oh my only light, like as the
right,
the flower like taking in and processing its nutrients. That's what writing poetry is like for him, turning toward God or turning toward what is life-giving. And
I think there is, I'm glad you mentioned that. There is that very deep thing, but that there's also a kind of humbleness. There's a kind of modesty. He's not calling himself a poet and relish poetry.
Mm-hmm. He's merely turning, the good is coming from the sun or from God or from somewhere else. He's just passively processing it the way the plant does.
And versing, I suppose, evokes
but I think what Bill is saying is that there's something slightly deprecating about versing as opposed to writing poetry. I mean, just as a word.
I think
I agree.
Just by focusing on the verb, it almost sounds, it has a sound to me like, whistling. The emphasis isn't on the product, the poem,
right?
On the whistling.
I'm just writing verses. I'm putting stanzas together and the lines rhyme and I can do it again. I can do it again. I haven't been able to do it. And even this kind of, Bill, I think that was a really important point to raise. And I think your implication is absolutely right. The more I think of it, the more it's Herbert saying, well, it's just this little thing that I do that I haven't been able to do, and I can do it again.
Yes, and does verse and reverse reach back etymologically to the activity of ploughing? The ploughman reverses as he turns the plough back for the next furrow. In that sense, he's associating poetry with a humble activity, perhaps the kind which might have been pursued by parishioners in Bemerton.
Yeah, I know. I tell my students when I had students, I ask them, well, what's the difference between prose and verse? And prose means you just keep going forward. It's, moving forward. And verse means, well, you get to the end of the line and you change direction. And verse literally means, to turn, to reverse, inverse, perverse. So versing, just in a very literal way means, well, I'm doing the kind of thing where you get to you reach a certain point in your in writing, and then you change direction. You go back to the margin, or you indent, or something, putting verse together. And there is, I think you're absolutely right that there's a kind of humbleness, humility, a kind of modesty about what it is that is so important for him that he hasn't been able to do, and that he can now do again. And he's obviously doing it in this poem.
And I love that it's versing and you've got a verb, as opposed to writing poetry instead of poetrying. Okay,
right.
it's
right.
versing.
No, exactly. Exactly.
Or poetrying. So I love the versing.
Yeah, I just think that's, I mean, I think if you're a writer, that you just have to love this moment in this poem and in the whole history of poetry, to actually say, and then relish. Just seems like absolute magic and sort of genius to me, to say so simply, I mean, to get exactly the right word for what he is experiencing in being, and essentially, I mean, at least on one level, in just writing this poem, in just being able to write this poem that he's working on.
I think this is perhaps anticipated by, in the second line, thy returns.
Thy returns.
There's a startle in that, because we just, financial now, but return, it's usually just one. It's only nature that has that cyclical, but in human affairs, losses aren't restored. So, and then he's going to lead us to this sense in which there is a return within himself.
Right. But I think that I absolutely right. But now you make me want to think more about the word returns, because we also use it as a kind of, as a financial term.
Yes. I wondered if that is a,
and as a travel term, and as a term about memory.
But we say many happy returns.
Many happy returns. Yeah, exactly. That returns itself. I mean, I really haven't given that word a lot of thought, but thinking about it now, that it's such an important word and such a loaded word to come at the beginning of the poem. So I think that's wonderful. I once more smell the dew and rain, and he's really kind of living it. He's really there in that moment. It cannot be, I can't believe it, that I am he on whom thy tempests fell all night. And then I guess my other favorite moment in the poem, which means one of my favorite moments in all of poetry, is in the second line of the last stanza. These are thy wonders, Lord of love, obviously different from Lord of power. So there's something more intimate going on, but to make us see we are but flowers that glide. And I mean, it's just what an uncanny, what an amazing, charming, impossible possibility of that. Man, yeah, Ted, yeah, I know, absolutely. But we are but flowers that glide. Any thoughts about any further thoughts about glide?
His hand has been forced by the rhyme scheme, isn't it? He's got to come up with a word which will rhyme with bide and pride. So in one sense, he comes up with the word under duress, but it's an odd word and takes us by surprise. But and he may not have come up with it, but for rhyme obliging him to contemplate it. But it seems that it's an unusual thing for a flower to do, isn't it?
Indeed, impossible.
Yes. But
I think I would argue that it's the other way around.
Okay.
That he started with we are but flowers that glide, and then he had to find other rhymes to go with that, because that's the inspired. That seems to me the really one of the real inspired moments in the poem, that maybe maybe the poem even started with that image, and that everything else kind of works itself in.
If I could suggest something,
I don't know.
Yes, gliding is a graceful, sometimes swift, beautiful movement.
Yeah.
Flowers are often described as blossoming, dying, blooming. In a way, all of those forms of movement are implicit in glide. And if you have, the poem has described everything a flower can do, more or less. And this, that word summarizes all of those things in a way that suggests they're beautiful. So, okay, in a way, there's a kind of acceptance. Okay, I realize I'm caught in this cycle. You're the one who has all the power. But sometimes it feels good. So we are but flowers that glide. And I think the ambiguity of the word pushes us back to all the other potential actions that flowers take, because flowers are active in this poem.
Except the one thing they don't do is glide.
Right.
Yeah, they don't. So then we have to make the leap.
Right, exactly.
Okay, we have to make a leap back to figure out what glide could imply.
It's also a part of that, I think, is that it's a lateral move. That in stanza 5, they grow in a straight line.
Head up and down.
Is this Tower of Babel imagery.
Right.
And then that the glide is to do something impossible, but also something that somehow spares you from hubris by moving laterally.
Yeah. Yeah.
Passing across the surface.
Yeah.
Instead of up from it.
But it's really, it's also a kind, it's like dancing. It's something uncanny, something really remarkable about the way, and in a way, something that kind of not just undercuts, but sort of transforms the whole image of the flower. And that, well, I'm calling this poem The Flower, but it's really about something else.
Hopkins' Windhover glides, doesn't it? And that's a poem which, with Ah, My Dear, reaches back to Love 3. So it's already making allusions to Herbert. And I've never thought of the gliding in the Windhover as particularly related to this poem, but maybe
no,
did.
I haven't either. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And that's an extraordinary moment in Hopkins.
Yes, the hurl and the gliding, yes.
Yeah.
And then it sort of devolves into an image of a skate moving smoothly around a bend, doesn't it, I think, so which picks up on the gliding.
Right. Well, Marita, you are there in the library, masked and patient as always, but I think we need to let you go. And thank you again so much. And this was great. I learned so much from this, as I always do from our discussions. You know, I think I know these poems inside out, and oh, thank you for quoting Elizabeth Bishop, Jennifer. Could you just say those lines out loud so that we can hear them before we say goodbye for today? Jennifer, oh, yeah, there you are.
It's the last lines from her poem called Poem.
Right.
The iris crisp and shivering, the water still standing from spring freshets, the yet to be dismantled elms, the geese.
Yeah. Well, Tom, as you say, Herbert was her favorite poet. And thank you, everyone. Have a great holiday.
Thank you, Lloyd.
Happy
Thank
New
you,
Year.
Lloyd. And thank you, Marita.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Marita too.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Everyone.
Thank
And
you, Marita and Lloyd. And
be well. Happy New Year.
Merry
And
Christmas.
hope to see you again sometime, as a date, a Saturday yet to be announced, with a poem yet to be announced in January. And be well, everyone. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for the company.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This is probably one of the most beautiful discussions. This is really wonderful. So,
oh, great.
I'll say there was so much in the chat today that will be recorded and in the video, but I hope that everybody's comments got included, but I think they might have, and maybe they'll add to the video. Wow. But yeah, it was really lovely, everyone. Thank you so much.
Oh,
thank you for making it possible.
Thank you, Marita. And
Merry Christmas.
Couldn't have done this without you. Thank you so much.
So glad to be here. Thank you. Take care, everyone.